voices at 210. My name is Dan Birchfield. I'm the pastor at First Presbyterian Church Visalia, which is the owner of the 210 coffee shop. And we just wanted to say welcome. It is great to have you all here tonight. We are so excited to hear about the voices of the Great Depression from Terry Ommen and to hear some more music from the era. And we just wanted to let you all know that if you are looking for a place to worship on Christmas Eve, our church is having a service at 7 p.m. in the sanctuary, and we would love to have you. And then on Christmas Day, it's Sunday, so the church said I had to work. So we're also having an 11 a.m. service in the sanctuary, and we would welcome any and all of you to come. With that, I want to hand the mic over to Paul Hurley, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, let's give it up for Pastor Dan Birchfield, please. Hey, Pastor Dan, is there any way we can get a tip jar or something back there by the door so when people leave they can make a donation to 210? That would be awful nice, yeah. I've never known a pastor to turn down a request like that, huh? Good evening. My name is Paul Hurley. I've been associated with this enterprise called Tulare County Voices at 210 for almost 15 years now. We've been going. Used to be 210 Connect. And for almost 15 years, we have had a holiday tradition of asking our good friend Terry Ommen to present a historic program about local history here at 210. Tulare County Voices at 210 is a program that's dedicated to open and diverse discussion of issues in our community that reflect our community's values, its people, and its concerns. And we meet every month, or we have been, here in this room. It's going to be the second Tuesday in the month going forward at 7 o'clock. And we will have various programs and people to lead discussions about issues of importance to the community. So I hope you will continue to attend Tulare County Voices at 210 here on Tuesdays, first, second Tuesdays of the month. Even if we don't have quite as entertaining a speaker as Terry Ommen is, because he's tough to top. As I said, Terry has been coming back to us every December, almost. We had a little break of something called the COVID pandemic. I don't know, maybe a few of you people heard about that. But for that, he's been here almost every December in that time and covered all kinds of fascinating local history. The Visalia Times Delta refers to Terry as Visalia's preeminent local historian. I don't know who came up with that, but I haven't heard anybody contradict it. So, and he definitely knows this stuff. I know you people know him. You're familiar with his work and his programs here. So I don't want to take up any more of his time. So I will just get off the stage, bring Terry Ommen onto the stage. Please welcome my good friend, Visalia's preeminent historian, Terry Ommen.
Ryan, are we good? Audience, are we good? Yes. Okay, good. Let me get a little bit organized here. What's that? I have a microphone. Can you hear it? Turn it up. Does anybody else need it up? Okay, I'll just try and talk louder for you, Art. How's that?
Maybe we can get Art a seat on the stage.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to see so many people here, so many familiar faces again tonight, and I thank you for that, for making the journey. I know you have other things you could have been doing, but you're here instead, so that's one for local history. So I appreciate that again for you doing that. Um, I know Richard has talked to you already about some of his background. Richard is a performer from Springville. And when I called him up, I asked him if he had any good Woody Guthrie, uh, Great Depression kind of music. And little did I know, he's a music historian and has a repertoire that probably goes much, much deeper than that. But his short answer was yes, he can do that. So right now, we are going to ask him to do one song, and he's going to surprise all of us with the title. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Richard Frost.
Thank you. And I'll sing it again. People I've known, places I've been, some of the problems that troubled my mind, and a lot of good people I left behind. Singing so long, it's been good to know you. So long, it's been good to know you. So long, it's been good to know you. It's been a long time since I've been home. I've gotta keep drifting along. I went to your daddy and asked him for you. He said, oh, please take her, please do. She doesn't cook or sew, she won't sweep the floor. So I picked up my hat and walked out the door singing, so it's been good to know you. So long, it's been good to know you. So long, it's been good to know you. It's been a long time since I've been home, and I've gotta keep drifting along. I walked down the street to the grocery store, a place that was packed with both rich and poor. I asked the grocer, he said 1 pound of butter for 2 pounds of gold. Singing so long, it's been good. So long, it's been good to know you. It's been a long time since I've been home, and I've gotta keep traveling on. One more time, singing so long. It's been good to know you. So long, it's been good to know you. So long, it's been good to know you. It's been a long time since I've been home, and I've gotta keep traveling on. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for that. Get us in the mood for the Great Depression. Again, thank you for doing that. You have another engagement, so if you need to move your equipment,
Yeah, I'm gonna just drag it back here and kind of shuffle out
Yeah, okay, that'd be fine. Yeah, you're fine. First of all, I want to thank Brian back there, our tech guy. Brian is an amazing talent when it comes to technical stuff, and he's been a great guy to work with. So he's our smart guy when it comes to technical stuff. So thank you very much, Brian, for all you do there. And secondly, the Visalia Times Delta and First Press, it's a partnership that they've created to offer this program to the community, and I want to thank both of them. Paul's an amazing guy. He's been a friend and a talent in Visalia for many, many years, and thanks to him, we get so much of the beautiful writing that appears in the Delta. And Pastor Dan, there you are. I didn't get a chance to say hi this year, but I'll say hi now. Thank you for your church and letting us do this. My wife never wants me to do this. She always says, don't do that. But I always turn her down and do it anyway. And that's to thank her for all of her talent. I would not be standing here if it wasn't for her, this talented lady who's also in the booth, going to be working the slides. So she's my wife of 51 years. So thank you for that. Thank you, Larry. And now you can put your head back up. But most of all, I really want to thank you folks. Again, like I said before, you have other choices for a Tuesday evening, but you picked to come here, and that is a very, very nice compliment for me personally and for local history in general. Tonight we have a lot of material to go over, and it's a fairly short amount of time. We got about 50 minutes, and at the last 30 minutes of this, in which our plan is to leave here by 8:30 tonight, but about 8 o'clock, I'm going to shut my part of it down and open it up to the audience. That's all you folks, and that's when your jobs take over. And your jobs are to share some of those stories that you've got deep in your brain about what your mama, daddy, grandpa, or grandma told you about those Great Depression years. And so think about that. At 8 o'clock, we're going to ask you to share some of those, the ones you care to share. So that's your job, is to think about that between now and about 8 o'clock. And my job is to get as much information to you before then as I possibly can. And I liken that to this. I thought, how can I do that? It's sort of like putting 10 pounds of See's candy in a 1 pound box. It still would taste good, but it's kind of messy. And I'm hoping to limit the mess tonight, but it's a lot of material to put together in a short amount of time. But we're going to try and do it in a fairly organized way. So first slide, please. We got to give you some background. Prior to the 1930s, we had some boom years, some pretty good boom years in the 1920s. We had Charleston, and we had jazz was introduced. The economy was buzzing along pretty good. People were feeling very optimistic about what was going on. And I think part of the problem for the 1930s is that the 1920s, really, there were some indications of some economic problems coming up, but not a lot of them. People were invested in the stock market, and the market was going so good they were borrowing money to buy more stock because everything was going up. And so it was let the good times roll kind of thing in the 1920s. And I think that's what really made October 29th, October 29, 1929, so devastating. It was known as Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday, and if you'll go to the next slide, please. But before I do that, let me tell you, in 1930s, we had what I call a perfect storm of circumstances. They're a little bit separate, each one, but yet they're all kind of interrelated. Number one is the stock market crash, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. Bank failures, which I'll also talk about. Drought and dust and farming practices in the middle states, high plain states. Production falling on goods and services, and unemployment. So, next slide, please. On October 29, 1929, the stock market took a deep, deep dive. 16 million shares were traded that day, an amazing number of trades, and it was all going in this direction. Billions of dollars were lost in the market just in that one day. And then it struggled for a while, and it eventually came back a little bit. But when the 30s were over, the stock market had lost 80 to 90% of its original value. That's a big hit. So Black Tuesday is, by most accounts, considered the beginning of the Great Depression. And it was because of that, basically, that ushered in some of the other things we're going to talk about. Next slide, please. High unemployment. Well, when the businesses start to decline and their stocks fall, production of service of their goods starts to fall. If they don't sell a lot of goods, they don't need all the employees, and so unemployment began to escalate. And so you had high unemployment. In fact, at the height of the Great Depression, it was about 25% unemployment in our country, which is a huge number. I think during COVID, what did we have, 10%? Was that our unemployment rate? I think it was. I think the employment element, and I think you'll agree with me as we go through, is probably one of the most important of those 5 or 6 perfect storm things I mentioned, because without a job, not much happens in this economy. And so I think you'll find and agree with me that high unemployment is the 1,000-pound gorilla. Jobs are a priority in our economy. Next slide, please. Breadlines. Stock market dives, unemployment increases, people, they don't have any money. The buying disappears. People aren't buying anything because they don't have anything. They're afraid of what's happening in the economy. They don't know what to do. And even during COVID, I think we saw where people hunkered down and they didn't want to take any chances, so they kept their money close at hand. Well, those that had money could do that. Those that didn't ended up in bread lines and soup kitchens and that type of thing. Family incomes during that 1930s period dropped by 40%. So it was a huge, huge hit. Next slide, please. Bank failures. It goes to show that once the economy starts to nosedive, the banks had lent out so much of their money to failed businesses. Now they were failed businesses. They lent their money to farmers, and you'll see in a minute why the farmers couldn't pay the mortgage on the farmland. And so bank failures came about. It's estimated that 11,000 banks shut down during the Great Depression. There were runs on banks. People were afraid, so they said, I'm getting my money out of the bank. Well, they'd stand in line and the bank didn't have the money. And so the confidence of the banks dropped like a rock. And so all at once, the people that had money stuck it in their mattress, didn't spend it, were guarding it very carefully. People that had no money were just scrambling to try and survive. So next slide, please. Now you got the next thing, which is the dust storms in the Middle West. Oklahoma, Colorado, Texas, and that was a whole collection of things by itself. Farmland in the 1920s was increasing like crazy all over the country, especially in those middle states. Mechanization was starting to be introduced to farming, ranching, and so they were digging up land that hadn't been planted before and tearing up the weeds and the grasses that were there, getting ready for planting. And they do this deep, what they call deep plowing. And so they'd go deep and uproot the grasses and turn the soil almost into dust, very fine dust. Well, during the 1930s, they had 4 major droughts during that 10 years. And then they had wind. And so that powdery soil and the wind and the lack of water, well, next slide, please. Turned much of that country into barren land. This is a Dorothy Lang photograph from an Oklahoma scene. But look at that powdery stuff there with very little vegetation to hold it down. So those are the things that really started this whole thing going, this Great Depression moving on. Next slide, please. 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. Herbert Hoover had been the president up to that point. FDR inherited a big problem, as you can see. I mean, he came into it with the Great Depression really right there in front of him, and he had a plan. And he came up with a plan, and it was called the New Deal. And the New Deal was designed to create a whole bunch of different programs to deal with all the problems in the United States economy and in the existence for people in the entire country. And so he came up with what was called an alphabet soup group of programs. They all had initials, it seems like. WPA, TVA, CCC, PWA, and there's a whole list of them. You can go to the internet and see this whole list of alphabet soup programs, all designed to focus on one ailing element of the economy. Next slide, please. So he came in, he's now putting the New Deal in place. While that's happening, you can see on this map right here, this is migrants coming to California between 1935 and 38. Why California? California was having the same economic problems as everyone else, except it was a milder climate. The farmers were still doing okay. They weren't doing terrific. California farmers could farm 12 months a year, where a lot of the other states had to take off for the winter and so on. So California became a location of choice for many of those people fleeing that, what became known as that Dust Bowl. Those states of Oklahoma and Texas and Colorado became known as the Dust Bowl and became the Dust Bowl migrants. And that was the term that was used. It's been estimated, and I've seen all sorts of numbers, between 200 and 300,000 people from all across the country during that period came into California, looking to find a new life, because theirs had been uprooted, basically. You'll see there the darkest, biggest black dots are the states where the most people came to California from. So you can see Oklahoma there, you can see Texas, you can see Arkansas, Missouri, Arizona were big ones for migrations from people from those states to California. Okay, now I want to give you a chance to look at a quick video here. Next slide, please. And just a little bit of introduction to this.
Well, We're continuing Mr. Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl songs.
Okay,
from
it's starting
Texas,
right now.
Oklahoma,
Can you
and
pause it
California.
1 second?
As I rambled around over the country and kept looking at all these people, seeing how they lived outside.
Yeah, this is a Ken Burns. I'm sure you're familiar with Ken Burns. Ken Burns is a filmmaker, a documentary guy that does wonderful work with history documentaries. And you'll notice this is about a 6-minute video that he kind of encapsulates what was going on for the Okies. And those are the people that came from that Dust Bowl. They were kind of collectively called the Okies. But he did this for the classroom. And the narrator, by the way, is one of my favorite narrators, Peter Coyote. You'll hear his voice on a lot of those Ken Burns documentaries. So now if you'd play it, please.
We're continuing Mr. Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl songs from Texas, Oklahoma, and California.
As I rambled around over the country and kept looking at all these people, seeing how they lived outside like coyotes, around in the trees and timber and under the bridges and along all the railroad tracks and in their little shack houses that they built out of cardboard and tow sacks and old corrugated iron that they got out of the dumps. It just struck me to write this song.
I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming around.
During the 10 years of the Great Depression, California's population would grow more than 20%. Half of the newcomers came from cities, not farms. 1 in 6 were professionals or white-collar workers. Of the 315,000 who arrived from Oklahoma, Texas, and neighboring states, only 16,000 were from the Dust Bowl itself. But regardless of where they actually came from, regardless of their skills and their education and their individual reasons for seeking a new life in a new place, to most Californians and to the nation at large, they were all the same, and they all had the same name.
Okies, and we were made fun of, and you talk funny, and all of that. Or talk some more, you talk funny. And you hated that because it set you apart.
There was a sign in a movie theater in the Central Valley of California, which basically said niggers and Okies upstairs. That is, you can't sit down here with real people.
They were horribly mistreated. In some cases, they were treated the way blacks were treated in the South. There were signs similar to the signs they had in Dalhart, Texas, that said, "Black man, don't let the sun go down on you here." Similarly, there were signs all throughout the Central Valley saying, "Okie, go back, we don't want you."
About a third of all the recent arrivals, many of them former sharecroppers from the Cotton Belt, ended up in California's agricultural valleys, where farmers had always relied on migrant labor to pick their cotton, vegetables, and fruits. They settled in developments called Little Oklahomas and Okievilles, or moved with the harvests, sometimes traveling 700 to 1,000 miles in the season, staying in squalid roadside camps called jungles, or simply putting up a tent along the road or in an unused field. And they found themselves at the mercy of the contractors who conspired with the growers to drive down the field workers' wages.
They have the simple and sturdy values often bemoaned as lost. They are proud, strong people, patient, uncomplaining, intelligent. They want first of all to work, to have a home for their families, to educate their children. These simple rights are part of the heritage of Americans. It is difficult for them to understand that none of them remain. Their whole lives are concentrated now on one instinctive problem, that of keeping alive. Sonora Babb.
Sonora Babb, a former reporter, who had grown up in the area around no man's land, had found a new job with the Farm Security Administration. With her boss, Tom Collins, she went up and down the Central Valley, informing the newly arrived migrants about programs to provide them with food and medical assistance for their families, education for their children, and better living conditions.
Only a few days ago, we met a young man walking along the road to town in search of immediate work and help. His wife had had a baby 3 days before in an abandoned milk house separated from any camp, where they had taken refuge during the recent storms. He was desperate. Since the birth, his wife, their other children, and he himself had not eaten for 3 days. If he did not get something for them at once, she and the baby would die.
When the refugees learned Sonora had grown up on the southern plains, it helped establish a trust and respect that extended both ways. The government had also asked the photographer Dorothea Lang to come back to California to document the deplorable conditions among the migrants. Tom Collins and the FSA used her photos to push for creation of a handful of government camps with better shelter and sanitation for the steady stream of refugees who were arriving every day. Collins insisted that the camps be self-governed, with elected committees responsible for everything from sewing clubs and libraries to child care and cleanliness. But only a lucky few were able to find space there. And while the growers depended on the migrants for cheap labor, the locals, who were themselves suffering from the Depression, didn't appreciate anything that encouraged the newcomers to stay. Nor did the growers, once the harvest was over.
So when the migrant, both non-farm labor folks and the professional or the farm labor folks came over to California, many of them came to Tulare County. In fact, one population number says during the 1930s, Tulare County's population increased by 38%. Now, keep in mind that in the early 1930s, even though we were suffering from similar national problems, life was going on in a fairly routine way. You didn't get a lot of indication by looking at the newspapers that there was this crisis looming. But it took a few years before that caught up with everyone. In fact, when you look at the papers from the 1930s, you find some interesting things. You'd expect to see this doom and gloom. But rather than that, in the Chamber of Commerce's throughout the county, they were talking about planning for the rodeo, water issues, the Trans-Sierra Highway. They were talking about, let's create this Trans-Sierra Highway. Exeter Chamber was talking about the Emperor Grape Festival and rebuilding the Exeter Highway Arch, the one that was on the south end of the city way back when. So it wasn't a sense of crisis going on in those early years. 1930s were pretty routine in a lot of ways. Now, some of it was they were sticking their head in the sand and hoping that it would go away. But it was happening anyway. Some of these things we've talked about and we've seen on the video were happening. In 1931, let's see, which one is that? What's the next slide, please? Yeah, 1931, this was a front page ad in the Visalia Times Delta. Basically what the ad says is you better wake up and start to buy and spend money. don't hoard your money. They were big on get the economy going. In fact, one of the lessons they talk about, and it's too fine for you to read, but it says in there, you need to spend money. You start patronizing George today, and George will start buying from Tom, and Tom from Dick, and Dick from Harry, and Harry from you. So they wanted that hoarding to stop and get that money into the economy. They likened money into the economy just like blood in the circulatory system of your body. If you don't get it working, the system will die. And so that was their big push. That's really my first big indication that there was trouble in paradise, right there. Full page ad. Notice there's no one taking credit for that ad. I don't know if it was a federal program or if the Delta decided to do it on their own. I suspect this was a campaign that was going around the entire country. I don't know that for certain. But anyway, it was some indication there that things were not really going all that well in our community. But 1938, Dr. Williams with the U.S. Public Health Service started to really knock on everybody's door and giving us the truth. He said, outbreaks of smallpox in Tulare County are increasing. Dangerous and contagious diseases are spreading. And most of it is coming through the migrant workers that are coming into Tulare County. And he said, because of primitive sanitation and woefully inadequate diets, these things are happening. He said treatment, it was more than medicine. He said it was food. And so San Francisco newspaper, I think, picked up on this because San Francisco Chronicle reported at that same 1938 period and gave Tulare County a pretty scathing bunch of information. They said deprivation, suffering among farm laborers and their families is beyond belief. It should all shock and arouse all of Californians. He said examples, husbands and wives, and these are all Tulare County examples. Husbands and wives and 4 children were living on 4 weeks on bread and potatoes. Tulare County children, 1 or 2 die every day, most of them migrant kids. He said in one Farmersville ditch camp, 21 to 22 children were malnourished or had medical problems. So where were the migrant folks living to have all this happening to them? Well, the lucky ones got to live with relatives when they came here, got to live in private camps by ranchers that provided living homes or facilities for the workers that worked on the ranch. Those are the lucky ones. Now, the private ranches were not always the best, but some of them were pretty good. I talked to Vic Vaca, whose family lived in the J.D. Martin Ranch and lived in their housing. He said they really liked it there. And he said they were very loyal to that Martin family because of the conditions they were allowed to live in. Private ranch. I'm sorry? J.D. Martin is toward Woodlake. But they also had one he also had a ranch in Delano. But the Delano ranch, they couldn't live on the ranch. They lived off the ranch and commuted to the ranch in Delano. In J.D. Martin here by Woodlake, they actually lived on the ranch, so there was no transportation problems. And again, they were very loyal, according to Vic, with the J.D. Martin company. Tegas, another private ranch. It's between Visalia and Tulare. Next slide, please. Tegas had a unique thing. They issued their own script. And they basically had a company store on site, People lived there, and part of their salary was paid in tokens worth 25 cents or whatever to be used at the company store. And so that has some benefits, but it also has some downsides. There's one place that'll accept the script, maybe, you know. But you had different varieties of living conditions for the immigrants that came here. And some of them lived on ditch banks. Some of them lived under bridges. Some of them lived in a tent next to their car or truck. And I remember when I first came to Tulare County, people said, this person is a ditch bank Okie. And I thought, what is that? I never heard that expression before. But that's an Okie that's kind of the poorest of the poor. I mean, if you got to live with your family along a ditch bank, and there was a big Hooverville, they called them Hoovervilles too, because Herbert Hoover was credited with causing the Great Depression. So they lived by the Patterson Bridge out by Patterson Track. And they had these little camps of people that lived there. And those were some pretty primitive conditions, you know, sanitary problems, food problems, that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So you got all these different kind of operations and conditions that people lived in. So they created the Farm Security Administration, and this is Tom Collins, and Ken Burns talks about him in his video, that he was one of the officials that tried to improve the housing conditions for the migrants. Because a diseased person, whether they're migrant or not, if they're not taken care of, it spreads and it causes more problems than it solves. So his job was to try and make sure that we somehow got decent housing with decent sanitation, medical services, etc. So next slide, please. So we had several government camps, and government camps were kind of considered the primo camps. I mean, this is the top of the rung. If you couldn't afford to rent a house in a community, then you could get a pretty good living at a government house. And Linnell, or it was first called Visalia Migratory Labor Camp. For 2 or 3 years, it was Visalia Migratory Labor Camp. Then it changed in 1942 to Linnell. But this is the one that's between Visalia and Farmersville. It's still there. It's hexagon shape, as you can see. In the center of that hexagon is a washing, showering, bathroom facility available to all those folks living around it. They had the community building. I believe it's the community building right in the center toward the bottom, the big building there. This facility was designed to be self-contained. It had good sewer system. It had water. It had post office. It had what? Somebody said? Well, there wasn't a grocery store here, but across the street there was one. Yeah, and you can actually see the little store right there at the center, at the bottom, next to the road. I think it is, yeah. But it was self-contained. And the idea was to give people everything they needed. There was medical facilities available to the people who lived here. When it was built in 1938, 200 families could live there. Next slide, please. School was East Union. East Union, which is just a short ways down the street. Yeah. This is one of the houses. When they first opened up, they had these tin houses. This one was not on Linnell, but this one was identified later. But they were 12 by 16 feet, And can you imagine living in that tin house in July and August in the San Joaquin Valley? Whoa, that was tough. Little uncomfortable, obviously. Originally, no electricity, no running water. Large families could get more than one tin house. I don't know what the break-off point was when you could get a second one, but for each one you wanted, you paid 10 cents per day for rent. And so the laborers had to pay for their lodging, but it wasn't an awful lot of money. But 10 cents in the 1930s was pretty decent money. So anyway, they also, next slide please. They also had their own newspaper. And the Visalia Migratory Labor Camp newspaper was called The Hub. It was a weekly paper, and it was very well done. I have access, and I have two of them, originals, and they're very nicely done. They're just a small version of a newspaper, but you can bet everybody in the camp really loved to read that and find out what was going on. It's called The Hub. Next slide, please. In 1940, Eleanor Roosevelt made a tour of California's camps. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, FDR's wife, actually came to Linnell and walked through the camp and looked at the camp. And she actually gave an interview to Charles Whitmore, who was the publisher of the Visalia Times-Delta at the time. And she gave a good interview thanks to some good questions that Whitmore gave her. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but he asked her, he said, the grapes of wrath, do you think Steinbeck exaggerated the plight of the farm workers? And she said, I never believed he exaggerated it much at all. So she basically concurred with what Steinbeck had written in The Grapes of Wrath, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. That's sort of like a new arrival coming to Linnell and some of these other government labor camps and private labor camps. They packed up everything they could get, and they hauled it in any way they could. And this was probably a pretty well-to-do family that could afford a trailer and a pickup. Yes?
You mentioned that there was a name change to Linnell from Visalia Migratory Camp. But do you know anything behind the reasoning for that? Did the Visalia Chamber want to change the name? And who was Linnell?
Linnell was a property owner in the neighborhood, probably owned that land. I researched that, and I could find no explanation for the name change. I don't know if Linnell maybe had donated the land and had asked for it to be named in his honor or the family's honor. I don't know. I just know Linnell was a family that owned the land in and around that particular site. Yeah, the motivation, I don't know. Yes?
Terry, in that previous shot where it shows Linnell Camp with the building.
With the aerial?
Yes.
Can you go to the aerial, please?
Off to the left, I don't know if you can make it out. There was a large home, just below where where you had that red mark.
Here. Here.
I grew up in this area, so I know what about in here, there was a big two-story house, and that was Linnell's house.
Oh, it was.
And it was burnt down. When I was a young kid.
Do you think Linnell owned the land that the camp was on then?
Yeah, I believe so.
I think so
That was
too.
the story around.
Yeah,
our
that's
area.
what I figured. Yeah, give that to Paul. Yeah.
They owned everything from Walnut Avenue to Caldwell.
Oh.
At one time, Linnell owned that whole thing.
Ah.
That big house.
But do you know why it changed to Linnell? Did he request it, or was it just done for unknown reason?
He had the store
Yeah, but I mean, you don't just change a name. There's a reason why it happens.
But the post office was in the little store.
Right. Yeah. But the motivation, I still don't know, to be honest with you. Yeah. Anyway, one more slide, or go back to where we were. Maybe that's where we were. Next slide, please. Oh, baseball. You know, and I'm just terrible at discipline on my time. This is that See's Candy thing. It's getting messy right now. There was fun at Linnell Camp. They were playing a baseball game at Linnell. And you know, I went into this research 20 years ago or 15 years ago and talked to this lady back in Oklahoma that had come out with her family as a small child and stayed at Linnell. And I expected to hear this sad tale of, whoa, this has got to be a tearjerker. When I was talking to her, I just knew it. And I said, how bad was it? She said, bad? It was good. She said, back in Oklahoma, I didn't have anybody to play with. My nearest friend was half a mile down the road, and you couldn't always go to play with her, so you ended up playing by yourself. She said, here I had kids around me. Everyone had children. They were all happy-go-lucky. What she didn't realize probably is that her parents were shielding her from some of the drudgery and the tough parts of living in that kind of a migratory environment. Art?
Tegas Ranch had a baseball team called the Tegas Tigers, and they would play Linnell, and I used to watch when I was a kid. Used to watch them play.
I'll be there, and they both...
They had a diamond in Tulare, right on 99 Highway, really a nice baseball field.
Yeah.
Tegas did.
Ah.
But they would come and play.
Oh.
All those camps had traveling baseball teams. They played each other. They go on Sunday, only on Sunday, and they drank a lot of beer.
But you know, the government, for those government camps, wanted to set them up like small communities. And so it doesn't surprise me that there were, you know, roving baseball teams and players going around. I mean, it was all part of being a community, right? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Well, it was 10 cents a day. Now, I don't know what their salary was or what their work pay was. I never figured that out, but you can base it on 10 cents per day per tin home. So, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know the answer. Yes?
My dad had a orange orchard in Lindsay, and he said people were happy to work for him for 15 cents an hour.
15 cents an hour? That would have been during the 30s?
Yeah, pre-World War.
Yeah, everything was just pushed way down in terms of, I mean, we can't even think of 10 cents for rent. That doesn't even compute anymore. But in those days, that was a different denomination of money, really. Next slide, please. You know, I'm going to close it with this one, and it's kind of a downer to close on. But during all this struggle and strife here with the economy, there was some labor unrests and some other unrests among the population. And this particular one I'm going to share with you is a big deal that was reported really throughout the state and certainly even beyond the state of California. It's one that we're not proud of as a county, but it's part of our history, so we don't want to just sweep it under the rug. In 1933, cotton workers down in the Pixley area were unhappy with the amount of money they were getting per 100 pounds of cotton that they picked. They were getting 60 cents per 100 pounds of cotton that they picked. They wanted $1 per 100 pounds. and they were not happy, and the ranchers would not give in to the $1 per pound per hundred. So the workers struck. They went out on strike. They went into the town of Pixley where their union headquarters was, and they got a pep talk from the union organizers there. And during that conference there, that speech from the union organizer, they saw 10 cars pulling in. Those 10 cars were full of ranchers. And the story gets murky here. So depends on kind of who you ask here. But what happened, and this is now we're dealing with October 10th, 1933. And it's called the Pixley Cotton Strike. And it, like I said before, it made news everywhere. All at once, gunfire broke out. We don't know if it's from the ranchers to the strikers, to the strikers to the ranchers. But there were a lot of shots fired. There were 2 people killed, 2 strikers were killed, 7 strikers were wounded. So that kind of tells me where most of the fire was coming from. So 2 strikers killed, 7 wounded. Big deal. That made news everywhere. The Pixley Cotton Strike. 8 ranchers were arrested for murder. Some of the strikers were arrested for disturbing the peace and some other more minor charges. In January 1934, their trial of the 8 ranchers was right here in Visalia, a block away from where we are today, Courthouse Square. That trial, they were put on trial and they were found innocent. Their defense was they were sent there by the Tulare County Sheriff's Department to help control a mob that was getting out of control, and that would be the strikers. And that defense worked because none of them were found guilty. They were all released. Now, interesting part of that story is for years, I struggled with who fired the first shot. That was an important thing for me for whatever reason. Who started the fight, you know? And no one seemed to know that. And then all at once, Mark Arax and Wartzman's book, The King of California, came out. And in that book, he interviewed some of the Salyer family members over on the west side. And according to the family members, Salyer says that he probably killed one of the strikers. So admitted it, basically. And I think that probably implies he was the first shooter, although it may not have been the case. But it points out that sometimes it takes a while for some of these facts to come out. But anyway, I think we're gonna stop right there, I think, and give you a chance to comment.
Get a couple of minutes if you want to.
Huh?
Give a couple of minutes. Do you have anything else?
Well, let me just mention another thing, which, you know, history is kind of one of those things that some of these things you'd rather not remember. You'd rather not, you know, have tagged to your body. Like Pixley can't be real proud of the Pixley Cotton Strike shootout in 1933, but yet it's the history. In 1929, there was another incident. It wasn't so much a union thing, it was a racial thing, and it happened in the little town of Exeter. 1929, again, before Black Tuesday. Had nothing really to do with the Great Depression, but it's kind of tied in. Filipino workers were fruit pickers in Exeter. They were invited there. The farmers needed the labor, so they were invited to come to work. And there was an incident in the town where a white fruit picker got into a fight with a Filipino fruit picker, and the next thing they know, that we all know, is that Exeter ran out every Filipino in and around the town, and there were a lot of them working there. And so that's not something that Exeter is really proud of. It happened. Can you ignore it? No. Can you remember it and make sure it doesn't happen again? Yes. At least you could try. But I mean, history is like that. Some of it's good stuff and you have a big smile and you're all proud, and others you kind of hang your head saying, why did you have to talk about that? And so when I wrote about that, especially recently, I thought, you know what, I'm going to stir up some hornets' nests with this story. But you know what? Sometimes these hornets need to be stirred up, and not to, be shameful about it, but so that we learn from it. Doesn't happen again. Paul?
I have to mention that another one of those incidents, Visalia, and the Visalia Times-Delta did a big piece on this a few years ago, recalling the state convention by the Ku Klux Klan, which was here in Visalia.
I didn't get to the KKK yet.
And the the Visalia Times-Delta, some of my predecessors at the opinion page welcomed the Ku Klux Klan as fine citizens and upstanding members of the community. So, yeah, things change. and not everything about our history is something we can be unadulteratedly proud of.
Yeah, the 1931 convention that Paul's referring to, the Grand Dragon, who was the grand poobah of the whole Klan, came and was one of the speakers here at the Visalia Municipal Auditorium. It's where they had the event, the 3-day event. And after it was all over, his name was Moody. T.S. Moody was the Grand Dragon, or whatever the term is, for the big guy. And wrote this nicest letter to the Times-Delta. You wouldn't even think this is a hate organization. It was so mild, it was so polite. And it said, I thank your paper for such respect and courtesy you've shown us. You guys are terrific. We loved Visalia. The people were so good to us. And you go, wait a minute, is this that same hate organization that does all the lynchings?
At the time, the Klan was considered in some quarters like Rotary is today, or the Lions, or the Kiwanis.
Well, you could. The Klan had their meetings posted in the lodges and clubs section of the Delta. I mean, anyway, if you want to know more about the Klan, Newell, hold up your hand, please. Newell is probably the most knowledgeable about the Ku Klux Klan, not for bad reasons.
Newell, you didn't bring your robes with you tonight, did you?
He's a heck of a writer, and he did some great research, and I think he and I agree on a lot of the conclusions that we've come up with. But any questions, Newell's the man. Okay.
So, I think I said in the paper, Terry likes to connect the dots, and one of the things he wants to do is hear from some of you about any recollections that you might have collected from family members or people that you know about the 30s, or any other comment you want to make, observation, story. Now's your time. We got a couple of roving mics. How many people right now know that they would like to say something, to make a comment, a story? Got to be more than 5. Okay. All right. Good. Okay, Melinda, you pick somebody out. Is somebody back down there in the road down there?
There, now it's good. I'm going to start right here.
Raise your hand again, ma'am.
I have a quick question. I grew up on Walnut Avenue before Farmersville Boulevard, and there used to be like a 2-story apartment building right to the east of Linnell Camp. I thought that was also part of a migrant, no?
I don't know. Does that sound familiar to you, Eric?
It was right next to the the
It wasn't
ditch.
on the grounds, you don't think, of the Linnell?
It was just past the end of Linnell Camp going east on Avenue 288, before you get
I
to
don't know.
Visalia.
I'm sorry, I don't know, and it
They-
doesn't sound like Eric knows
They
either.
tore it down, and actually there was a, what year? Well, I was in the 60s when it got torn down.
And you're not talking about the big house on 198 that used to be, oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know, I'm sorry. Yeah. I doubt that it would have stayed on that property. I don't think Linnell would have kept that as part of it. I don't think. Yeah.
That area she's talking about was the barracks. That's where they had the Quonset huts and stuff that when people first came out, they stayed in before they could find lodging in the housing area.
Well, did it look like barracks, or was it a house?
It was a two-story multi-level, like an army barracks would be.
Okay. Well, good. That sounds like you hit it on the head there.
And
So
the
it was
other
like
thing
a
is,
reception
people,
center
you know,
then?
pardon?
Like a reception center when they
No,
first...
people live there.
Oh, they did.
Yeah, it was like an army barracks. You go in, you have cots and everything like that.
Maybe it's for single people or something.
Probably, I don't know, but they were there, and what she's saying is right, and that was right next to where the Quonset huts were.
Ah, okay.
And those Quonset huts were there. You know, you're talking about the 30s and 40s. They were there into the 50s before they tore them down.
Yeah.
Probably late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
People lived
Well,
in.
and don't forget the tin building I showed you. They didn't stay forever. They went out into the community. In fact, you can still see some that people, I guess, bought at a surplus sale or something when they got rid of them because they use them as storage sheds. And by the way, the Tulare County Museum has one of those that you can actually see. It's pretty amazing. They got a great display on that Dust Bowl era in the
Sure, I see one every
at
day.
Mooney Grove. What's that?
I see one every day.
Do you have one?
My dad did.
Oh, is it still there?
It's still there.
Well, you know, when I was on a quick hunt for those buildings, because I wanted to get one for the museum, and I could find them, I just couldn't get anybody to surrender it. But one of the buildings had a Butler sign on it. And Butler Manufacturing used to be a big company here. Well, that's what they made. And it was a Butler building, one of those tin sheds. I thought that was interesting. Yes?
I talked to my mother today, and she's 100 years and 4 months old. And my grandparents came here they lived in the country real close to Memphis, Tennessee, and they really resented being called Okies because they weren't from Oklahoma. But they were treated so badly that they went back to the Memphis area. And then when my parents came here, let's see, in 1951, Mom said they were still such prejudice that because my dad looked Mexican, he didn't know what a Mexican was. He'd never seen one. He was Irish. It's called black Irish. But he had black hair and deep, deep blue eyes that looked brown. And he had darker skin. And everybody spoke Spanish to him. He didn't know what they were saying. But she said the prejudice was so strong that they would not let my mom and dad rent a house in Hanford. They had to live in Armona because they were considered, Dust Bowl
Okie was
Okies.
derogatory.
And very derogatory towards somebody who wasn't from Oklahoma.
If you have a comment or question, raise your hand. We got people coming around with a microphone. Sir, you're next. Go.
My grandfather was a house painter in suburban Chicago, and this was in the early 30s, well, his whole life, but he had collected a couple of jobs that he had just finished, and it was really the last money the family had. He went into the local bank and made his bank deposit, and as he walked out of the bank, they locked the doors behind him and closed the bank.
It was a bank closure. They were
It
shutting it down.
it was literally the bank closure. He deposited the bank. It was like 1 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, and as he walked out the door, they locked the doors and closed the bank right behind him.
But see, nowadays, FDIC supposedly protects us from that, right?
We have a question here.
One thing I'd like to say about that movie, Grapes of Wrath, remember all the bad camps? And then there was one good camp? That was Tagus Ranch, folks. Don't you remember? They say, we're going to go north on 99. There's a good camp up there, and it's owned by the Merritt family, and that's who owned it, and that was Tagus Ranch. Just thought I'd let you know.
So were you at Tagus?
Yeah, no, my brother-in-law lived there and the whole family. I used to go over there all the time.
So
Every Sunday I watched the ball game.
So your family's a loyal Tagus.
No, I'm from Kentucky. We came out in '46 after the big war.
Okay. Okay.
So my grandfather came out in '37 from Oklahoma. He had worked in the 20s for Kaler Lumber Company out of Missouri, and in the mid-20s, the KKK went after him and eventually got him fired from his job because his dad was from Illinois, German settlement, and they spoke German at home and they were Catholic, and there weren't many Catholics, 1% or so in Oklahoma. So he moved east to the Choctaw Indian Territory to Antlers and put the kids in an Indian mission school and started his own business because he wasn't going to get chased out.
Wow.
But in '36, he would saw lumber and sell it all year, and in the fall, the wholesaler would pay him for the lumber. And in '36, the wholesaler said, sorry, Oscar, I'm broke. I can't pay you. So he came out, went up the coast, looking for somewhere where he could buy timber and not have to buy the land, because there he'd buy land and then cut it, then pay for another section of land to cut with his money he got in the fall. So we lived in Tuggleville. My birth certificate says born in Tuggleville.
Oh, wow.
So he moved there in '37. Same kind of stories. Grandma said people wouldn't rent him a house in town because they said the Okies just tear up the floor and burn them in the fireplace. So they ended up in Tuggleville, where a lot of Okies were, Mr. Tuggle, and also the Levins. They were Jewish. They weren't allowed in town. The Bank of America wouldn't give us let us open a bank account. They said, you got to go to Tipton because that's where the Okies bank. So as a kid, I would ride with my grandma down to Tipton to bank for Lampe Lumber. That was our company. So we'd go down there and do the banking in Tipton. Where is Tuggleville? Tuggleville is now part of Tulare. It was just south of Tulare. The businessmen there and the people there formed a little business association that met even till I was in my 50s. And my grandmother in the 30s and 40s was the secretary. And I have a little flyer somewhere where Tuggleville was, they were going to have their own railroad station, bus station, and their own bank, separate from Tulare because, Tulare didn't want them. Then also you talk about the sports. My parents, my mom and my uncles said that the way you got accepted in Tulare was through athletics. So they were pretty good athletes, and they said that's how they got accepted into society in Tulare. And this was in the 40s, mid-40s, late 40s.
Yeah.
So
Wow, thanks for
sometime,
sharing all
if
that.
you want, I can give you a lot of
Oh.
Tuggleville stories, because I lived there
Well,
till
was
I went to college.
Was Tuggleville known then for that Okie population living
Yes.
there?
Yeah, Mr. Tuggle was a had a furniture store, and he was from Oklahoma.
Well, I knew Troy Tuggle.
Yep,
the son.
Troy. Yes.
Yeah, and he
Good guy.
he shared a lot of information with me. But it's an interesting story because his father was the unofficial mayor of
Right.
Tuggleville.
Right.
And he's got a picture of his dad holding up a sign saying mayor. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
my
thank you.
dad ended up to be the first person from Tuggleville to be probably mayor of Tulare. He was a mayor of Tulare for a while.
Ah.
So anyway,
Wow.
that was in the 70s. That was 40 years later.
Sometimes things change, but then again, sometimes they stay about the same.
That's great. That's great. Those are just the kind of stories we want to hear, okay?
Yeah.
When you have the mic, remember to keep it close to your mouth, unless you talk loud like I do.
We got a couple here. questions?
Hello, hello. I just wanted to make a comment about Tegas Ranch. I was born at Tegas Ranch, 1951. So because of that and because of my natural curiosity about everything, I asked a lot of questions. And since you showed the coins up there, you know, the people during the time they got paid in script, they got 10% of their wages in that script, which, as you mentioned, was redeemable only at the Tegas Ranch store, grocery store. Well, that was put an end by the merchants in downtown Tulare because very quickly they realized that all that script money that was being spent was not being spent on K Street and Kern Street and down there. But anyway, it's great to be here. And
Now tell me, when you were a worker at Tegas, then you got 10% of your salary in script?
well, that system was put to an end, I believe, in the 40s. Okay.
But I mean,
So
where did
when
it
I
go?
was born in 51, my parents and everybody at Tegas were being paid 100% in cash.
Oh, okay.
You know, but still, again, many stories about the script. And I had friends who found, you know, piles of that script in the warehouses. There's still a lot of that script around. I mean, some of us still have them, you know, but it's one of the many interesting stories about Tegas, and I'm happy to discuss that with anybody who is interested. One other thing about Tegas, the people who live there and the descendants of the people who live there still have a reunion once every 2 years at Mooney's Grove.
They still do?
Yes,
Ah.
we just had one not too long ago.
Oh.
And the one before that, we had people from Germany, the East Coast of the United States, people, you know, in between Virginia and California, they all came. And what was special about that one is that descendants of the owner, Hewlett C. Merritt, were also there. You know, and that was really interesting because they had stories about their great-grandfather, et cetera, which sort of jibed in with some of the rumors we had heard as kids on the ranch. And though he was a millionaire from the time he was 19, he was, as the story goes, and what is the word for extremely prudent? Cheap? And that was verified by his great-grandchildren. But anyway, it's great to be here. Great topic.
Let me ask you, were the people that you know that have a connection to Tegas, were they tend to be loyal to the operation of the Tegas camp?
Well, that's an excellent question. Do they happen to have loyalty to the community of Tegas Ranch? Yes. Yes, and many, many very humanistic stories about people helping one another. Did they have loyalty to the operations insofar as they worked and expected to receive the wages they were promised? Yes. But the reason there's some commonality in coming back in the stories was more so not because of the business operation of Tegas Ranch, but because of the community spirit among the people who live there. And again, Okies, blacks, Mexicans, they all lived in the various labor camps, and there were 12. And there were all kinds of stories about, like I was telling alone Tegas. They had help, they had company, they had rides to Tulare, to the Tulare County Hospital, and they were cared for. You know, and it's these stories, these human stories that keep coming, the reason the people keep coming back to the reunion, and there are children who never lived there. But they heard about Tegas Ranch from their parents and grandparents, so they want to come to the reunions.
Were there Sikhs at that ranch? People?
Not that I know of or heard of.
Okay, okay. Yes, question over here, Melinda. Sikhs?
Red Banks was another of the
camps. And I was born there, 1942. And, but there wasn't any Sikh house, so that they were separated from Red Banks was a fascinating place. It had one of the most beautiful old hotels I've ever seen.
Right.
And it was a small place.
I
But
think the building still stands, doesn't
no,
it? It doesn't?
unfortunately, because
Did it have a fire or something with it? Or?
I think so. It's totally gone from in the 90s. Because I was going to steal some doorknobs or something. But
Terry, I went to Strathmore High School with Butch Coley. You remember he was sheriff about 30 years ago, and he was one of the Okie kids, and he gained respect by being a good athlete, and he went through the law enforcement. And I invited him to participate tonight, but he did send me a personal message I thought I'd share. He says, "Thanks, Gene. I remember Terry Ommen quite well. I was a sergeant with the sheriff's department when he started with the VPD. I would love to be there. My folks were part of that migration from the Dust Bowl. I was raised in Okie. They were very proud, disciplined people. So much I could contribute on my street. Lawson is in Strathmore. Most were from the Dust Bowl. The Crawfords, the Joneses, the Vaughns, the Pattons, and others. All with great work ethics, took care of all their personal possessions, respectful, very competitive in sports, and good students. Many were good students and were married into well-to-do families, especially the Portuguese farmers they worked for. My folks came in January 1936. My sister Patsy was only 2 or 3 months old."
I understand Butch is back in Oklahoma now.
That's it, yeah. Paul, could I just add one more? Yeah, this is a cycle of life story. Butch moved back to Oklahoma, and he posted on Facebook his 3/4-ton truck pulling this god-awful big motorhome. And I'm just thinking, boy, that's justice. You folks came over to Jalop, and you go back in the motorhome.
Wait, I have one quick question, and I hate to take up your time, but this kind of ties in with what he said. I consider the Fox Theater to be a Depression-era building. Our Fox Theater the ground was broke in April 1929, 6 months before Black Tuesday. The timing of William Fox was not the best, obviously. But he opened that up, and there was this one kid from Oklahoma who remembered as a young man going into that Fox during the 1930s and walking in and looking around and seeing all that amazing stuff and feeling the thickness and plushness of the carpeting. And he always remembered that. And when, I got to remember his name here, give me a second here. Dwight Jordan grew up to be a prosperous businessman, and the Fox was going through restoration. He donated $25,000 to the Fox for new carpeting because of his experience. Now, is that an amazing story? That is. What's that?
He was 6'7".
Oh, I never met the man.
Yeah, I knew him. Dwight Jordan.
Was he in real estate?
And his wife was 4'10".
Was he in real estate?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a Fox story and a Depression story. Who's next?
Hold on now. We haven't had somebody with a question. Go ahead.
I was wondering, we know that not all the Okies who came west were white. There were black Okies. But I wonder if you have any idea how many, to what percentage, did places like Tagus and Linnell Camp have black residents there too?
Were they integrated or were they?
I don't know. You know what? I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe somebody here does. But there's an interesting community called Teviston that was primary African American. And I'm wondering now if maybe, just maybe, some of those Dust Bowl migrants that were black ended up there. I don't know the answer to that.
I know that I used to work with a wonderful African American lady who's now deceased, and she would tell me stories of coming out and living in tents along the railroad tracks with her very large family, and sometimes the only thing that kept them from going hungry was she would send her kids out to search for sweet potatoes that had fallen off the trains that had gone by south of Tulare.
Yeah, amazing.
So I know there were some African Americans in that movement. It's just I have no idea how many.
Yeah, Newell, does that sound familiar to you? Blacks that were part of that Dust Bowl migration? I'm not either, but I'm going to keep my eyes and ears open.
We have about 5 minutes left for questions, so if you have one, get your hand up now.
Okay. I worked at Tegas Ranch in the late 50s, and black guys were picking the peaches when I was packing them inside. So
Sir,
I
can
worked
you
in
start
Tegas.
over? Sue,
I
can you
started
start
in Tegas Ranch packing peaches in the late 50s when I was still in high school. And the guys out, there were a bunch of Negroes out then in the late 50s that were picking, and these poor guys, they were making, $1 a day, and I was making about $2.50 packing peaches, and I had air on me, and they were out there in 110 degrees. Felt so sorry for
By
them.
the way, Sue Merrill, Miss Tulare County, 19... No.
You are not nice.
What year was it, Sue? You can be mad at me, but... 61. Miss Tulare County.
My husband's family is from Oklahoma. They came out in the Dust Bowl migration, and I just wanted to point out that one of the reasons for some people to come, in their case, they were farmers. They were also, 3 of the granduncles were business people. Some of them stayed there and wrote it out and did wonderfully. His grandfather ended up coming here, finding that there really wasn't a lot of reception they didn't like the way Oklahoma people were treated. They went to San Diego and thrived. But the reason they came was because, other than the Dust Bowl taking all the crops and not having the money, was dust fever was affecting my husband's father. And he was 12, and they said they had to get him out of there because children were dying from dust fever. That was you couldn't. His grandmother would tell me you could not keep the dust out of your house. You didn't have a lot of water, and what you had, you tried to soak.
Where was that?
That was in Elk City, Oklahoma. They were from that region.
Oh.
And so they came out with everything that they could carry. But I wanted to comment that one of the things I saw through knowing his family, and also the stories that all these people tell, including my very first principal when I was teaching, Tom Merritt was from Oklahoma, but also Bill Adams, who had lived in Okie Camp. And those people were so resilient, and they went on to such success, and they built this area, this community, as much as the Portuguese and the Armenians have built it. And I'm just wondering in this room how many people here trace their heritage back to the Dust Bowl and to the people who came through it or came after it during the Depression years. I'm just curious if anybody...
How many of
just
you
how many
have roots that go to the Dust Bowl? I have a feeling there's quite a few, yeah. Yeah, I mean, once you come here, I came from Los Angeles up here, and I don't know that they knew then what the Dust Bowl was in LA. When I got here, I quickly found out everybody was from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Texas. I mean, that was just the way it was here. So it doesn't surprise me that we've got all these folks that have those kind of roots. Yes.
In the article you had in the Times Delta, it mentioned that the picture you had of Nathaniel Weiss was not Nathaniel Weiss. Do you have a picture of him?
We do not. But you know what? I fought that battle for a long time. Annie Mitchell, do not fight with Annie Mitchell. If she says that's Nathaniel Weiss, by God, that's Nathaniel Weiss. Now I could convince her it's not, but it's too late. But I can't convince all of you that read her book, The Colorful History of Tulare County, who she's got Nathaniel Weiss's picture, who's not. It's actually a man named Turner. But I can't convince anybody, because they'll say, no, you're wrong. Annie said, I stand corrected. Anyway, does that help? It's okay. Okay.
My family came out after the war. My family came out after the war, but I had a partner that was from Linnell Camp, and I just wondered how many folks here actually had friends or relatives and so forth that lived in Linnell Camp.
How about Linnell Camp friends and family? Anybody?
Terry, I think Phil Klein, our district attorney.
Phil Klein lived there. Absolutely. Lots of people lived there. Jim Armstrong. Anybody know the realtor Jim Armstrong here in town? He's got an office at the coast.
Sure.
He emailed me and said, I was born in Linnell Camp as a 2-year-old kid. I stayed right in one of those cabins. There are tons of people that have Linnell. Figure 200 families when it opened, and then they expanded and made it bigger and better. You can just imagine how many people came out of a Linnell Camp story. I mean, there are tons of them. Had to be.
Last call if you got a question.
I just have a comment, just a quick comment. When you talk about history repeating itself, I don't know if anyone's been in Tulare lately, but you've got Tent City along the railroad tracks, and also at, J Street and Cart Mill. I mean, there's just a block, and it's a tent city, and it's, when we drove there the other day, I just thought of this whole thing.
Yeah, I think the homeless will be one of those topics that 50 years from now they'll be talking about, just like we're talking about these other things. Yeah. Well, folks, that's so great.
Yeah.
I'm glad you guys shared. I learned a bunch. I hope that was an evening worth your while. Thank you for coming out, and we'll see you next year, maybe.
Thank you very much to Terry Ommen. Please sit down. Don't leave yet. I got a couple more things. Don't rush. Don't rush. Believe me, the traffic is not heavy out there right now. Once again, thank you, Terry Ommen, Visayas preeminent historian. Thank you, Richard Frost, for your entertainment. Appreciate it. Thank you to Pastor Dan Birchfield and First Presbyterian Church. I want to thank a couple of my colleagues on the Tulare County Voices at 210 planning team, Melinda Morales and Miley Melconian. Thank you. And we're going to be hard at work putting together a program for January 10th. Here we're going to explore some health and safety for women and some of the issues connected to that. So we hope that you will join us here at 210 on January 10th, again at 7 o'clock. Meanwhile, I wish all of you a very blessed Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you.